right. Well, looks like we're all set and ready to go. Awesome. All right. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Lucy Crosby. I'm going to be your first affirmative speaker today. Thank you all so much for taking your time to judge. We really appreciate it. And congratulations to the negative team.
And hello, everyone. My name is Emma Lowe, and I'll be your second affirmative speaker today. Again, thank you all so much for your time.
Hello, my name is Jahuai King, and I'll be the first negative speaker. Thank you all so much for your time.
And finally, my name is Antonio Wolf. I'll be your second negative speaker. Thank you very much. And once again, congratulations to the affirmative team.
All right. And before we get started, I think it would be helpful for both teams if we could hear a little bit about each one of you individually and perhaps what you'd like to see in this round. Starting with you, Mr. Davis.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Wonderful. So my name is Joseph Davis. I'm the head coach of speech and debate at Concordia University in Seward, Nebraska. I have been around the activity of speech and debate for a very, very long time. Team policy is my absolute favorite debate event. I am very open to whatever you want to run. I like a strong impact calculus. I like strong clash. And don't let me make the arguments for you because you might not like how it turns out. So cover all the bases, and I'm here to have a good time.
Awesome. Thank you. Mrs. Hemp.
So I'm Joanna Hemp. I'm a NCFCA parent. I have a competitor who's graduated and a current TP student. I coach TP at our local club, and I'd like to see clear arguments, and I'm not going to argue for you. So if you don't say it, it's not true. So if your opponent says something crazy and you don't refute it, their crazy argument stands.
Awesome. All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Higashi.
Hi there. I was NCFCA alumni. I competed 5 years. Team policy was my favorite forum. I would say as far as the judging philosophy is concerned, evidence, I like evidence, and I don't drop arguments. And kind of like Joseph said, a strong impact calculus is something that I look for in your arguments as well. So, yep.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And Mrs. Shipe?
Yes, hi. I'm excited to be here. I've been involved in debate for 28 years as a competitor and then as a curriculum author, coach, teacher, and I work for the league. I will add that evidence is very important to me, including citations. I pay very close attention to that. And speaking in a civil, comprehensible, conversational style.
Awesome. Perfect. And finally, Mr. Toes?
Yeah, as far as judging philosophy, I think they did our bios, but as far as judging philosophy, I like to have a good clash, 4-point refutation, keep it slow enough so I can flow easily. You don't want me to miss arguments on my paper because that makes it confusing. So, but yeah, clear arguments are the key.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much. I really appreciate it. We all do. All right. We're all ready to go. I've got 8 minutes on my clock. Perfect. I will go ahead and get started. The sun shines in Tiananmen Square on June 9th, 5 days after the infamous massacre. Deng Xiaoping's strong voice crackles over the microphone while he speaks of a new China, a China that would hide your brightness and bide your time. In doing so, China would begin to undermine the United States by winning a race that we hardly knew had even begun. Unfortunately, this vision has become a reality. Today, in order to provide for the common defense, the United States relies on imports of critical minerals from our chief economic and military adversary, China. It's for this reason that Emma and I stand resolved that the United States federal government should significantly reform its import and/or export policies within the bounds of international trade. And before going any further, I think it's important that we understand a little bit more about the critical minerals that I mentioned a few moments ago. These are called rare earth elements, or REEs. You can write this down as background point 1, REEs. Background point 1, REEs. According to Huaimin Kim, writing for the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy in 2021, quote, rare earth elements is a collective term for the 17 chemical elements in the periodic table, consisting of yttrium, scandium, and the 15 elements of the lanthanide series, unquote. Our access to rare earths is fundamental to our way of life. Not only are they used in virtually all commercial sectors, from medical technology to iPhones, but they're also a key part of our military defense systems. As Mark Schmidt, faculty of law, economics, and business at Martin Luther University Halle-Wittenberg writes, quote, many of the most advanced U.S. weapon systems, including smart bombs, unmanned drones, cruise missiles, laser targeting, radar systems, and the Joint Strike Fighter program, rely on rare earths. Against this background, the U.S. Department of Defense stated that reliable access to the necessary material is a bedrock requirement for the DoD, unquote. Now, given how important rare earths are to American national security, you would think that we take great care to make sure that we have reliable access to them. You'd be wrong. This leads us to Harm 1, China's REE stranglehold. Harm 1, China's REE stranglehold. For decades, the United States mined and processed rare earths right here in America. We built a strong national stockpile of these critical minerals and maintained our status as a net exporter of REEs. That all changed during the Clinton administration, when two things happened simultaneously. The United States started looking for a cheaper source for REEs, and the People's Republic of China built a stranglehold over the market using predatory tactics. This led to the reality that Karen M. Sutter, specialist in Asian trade and finance, described in June of 2019, saying, quote, every advanced weapon system in the U.S. arsenal, from Tomahawk missiles to the F-35 fighter jet, to Aegis-equipped destroyers and cruisers and everything in between, is absolutely reliant on components made using rare earth elements, including critical items such as permanent magnets and specialized alloys that are made almost exclusively in China. Ariel Cohen and James C. Grant write in June of 2021 for the Foreign Policy Research Institute that, quote, the United States also imported 98% of its processed REEs from China in 2018, unquote. China's predatory tactics, combined with the United States' apathy, have led to the grave consequence of the Chinese stranglehold over rare earths. This leads us to our impact. National security at risk. Impact national security at risk. For over 30 years, China has made rare earths a national priority. For over 30 years, America has not. Instead, we have allowed ourselves to become a net importer of these critical minerals and placed our security in the hands of the People's Republic of China as a result. Unfortunately, China has proven that they are far from reliable allies when it comes to rare earths. You can write this down as Harm 2, China's REE weapon. Harm 2, China's REE weapon. China views their rare earth stranglehold as much more than a simple economic tool. Rather, they have demonstrated a willingness to weaponize that stranglehold and wield it against countries that pose a threat to their interests. Peter Leder, former trade advisor at the Department of Defense, set up the danger all the way back in 2011, when he said, quote, the Pentagon has been incredibly negligent. There are plenty of early warning signs that China will use its leverage over these materials as a weapon. Leder was speaking over a decade ago. Fast forward to today, and the warning signs were right. The Australian Strategic Policy Institute noted in 2022 that, quote, the minerals have become weapons of diplomacy. We saw the Chinese government stop rare earth supply to Japan as a part of its economic coercion against the Japanese government. Since then, what countries have noticed is that there is a risk by having only one major supplier of rare earths. More recently, China threatened to limit rare earth shipments to American defense contractors because of U.S. arms sales to Taiwan, unquote. As tensions between the United States and China continue to grow, the danger of reliance on China for rare earths also grows. If there is any doubt in our minds that China will pull the rare earths trigger against the United States, know that China has no such doubts. A Bloomberg report in 2019 indicated that China had drawn up plans to restrict rare earth exports to the U.S. to be executed when necessary as a part of the intensifying trade war. When we take a step back and assess the clear harms created by the current situation, the conclusion we must draw is clear. When it comes to rare earths, current American import-export policies do far more harm than good. And it's for this reason that Emma and I propose the following plan. Under our mandate, Congress will pass and the President will sign into law a bill prohibiting defense contractors in the U.S. from importing rare earths from China to be used in our weapons defense systems at any point in the supply chain. The cutoff date for defense contractors to do so will be 2026. Our enforcement is the Department of Defense and any other necessary bodies. The necessary funding, in addition, will be appropriated in the coming fiscal years. This leads us to our advantage. End reliance on Chinese imports. End reliance on Chinese imports. Our policy prevents U.S. defense manufacturers and contractors from importing rare earths that are controlled by China at any point in the REE supply chain. By refusing to any longer be a net importer from China for rare earths, and we immediately take the first step in stopping an impending national security disaster, while hamstringing China's ability to cripple our military's defense systems. Passage of our bill will achieve two key things. First, it will detach the United States national defense industry from the predatory Chinese stranglehold. And second, it will incentivize the production of critical minerals in the United States and elsewhere throughout the world market. Alice Su explains the reality of how we've gotten to this point in 2019, when she says, quote, "As long as supply chain decisions are driven by prices, regardless of environmental costs or geopolitical risks, China will continue to dominate rare earth mining. China's advancement up the supply chain has been in plain sight for decades and enabled by companies' prioritization of low cost above supply security. The market has done this to itself by saying we're going to go for the lowest cost at any cost," unquote. As long as defense contractors are allowed to work with China with cheaper prices and with ease of purchase, they will continue to do so. Under our plan, they no longer have that option. I told you about Deng Xiaoping, who revealed China's national strategy. What I did not tell you is that using rare earths was always a part of Deng's specific plan to undermine the United States. As Deng Xiaoping once famously stated, "There is oil in the Middle East. There is rare earths in China." Thank you, and I'm ready for any questions the negative team might have.
All right, my timer's set for 3 minutes, and assuming everybody's all set, I'll go ahead and begin. Hey, that was an excellent speech. Naturally, I just have a couple of quick questions for you. So first off, can we get a copy of your 1AC?
Absolutely, Emma can go ahead and send that over.
Perfect. Can we agree that you have the burden of proof?
Yes, we have the burden to prove a harm in the current system and that our solution solves that.
Great. And you provide material advantages, correct?
Well, we're responsible for presenting a policy to Congress, once again, that presents a harm and then solving the harm.
Sure. Okay. Moving on, you mentioned a U.S. stockpile. How large is that stockpile?
Yeah, so currently in our U.S. stockpile, we hold 53.4 metric tons of rare earths and 4 out of the 17 chemical elements as of 2021.
Perfect. Thank you. And speaking on these rare earth elements, what makes them rare?
Well, specifically not the fact that you can find rare earth elements in many different places. I would grant you that point. However, the idea that we can process and have separate parts of the supply chain for every bit of it is what makes them rare. And so that's why China currently kind of has a stranglehold. Yes.
So it's difficult to process is essentially what you're saying. That's what
Yes.
makes it so rare. Okay, great.
Yes.
Thank you. Moving on, can I just nail down what exactly is your harm?
Yes, the harm in the current system is that our defense weapons are in order for them to function, they have to use Chinese rare earths currently. And that's simply not an acceptable amount of leverage for our foreign adversaries.
Has China ever cut off our rare earth exports before?
Our rare earth exports commercially as a whole, no, they have not. They did the same. They did do that to Japan in 2011, however. However, as Emma's going to detail, they have sanctioned American defense.
Okay, thank you very much. But just on this point, you're essentially saying that we are reliant on China, and that's the big harm because we're reliant on one of our adversaries. So we can agree that you would have to prove that we're actually reliant on China with these rare earth elements in order to warrant an affirmative ballot, correct?
Our harm, as we laid out in the first affirmative constructive, is that the defense sector specifically is reliant on Chinese rare earths currently.
Okay, perfect. I'm glad we can agree on that. Moving on. Do you have any evidence saying how long it will take for the U.S. to end this reliance, assuming they are reliant? Does a 3-year time period work?
Yes. So there's a clear reason why we have that time period of 2026, and Emma's going to detail that in her next speech. But yes, we do have evidence proving that point.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. My last bit of questioning, did Japan's tech sector collapse when China cut off their rare earth exports?
Yes, it did. Their entire economy collapsed, and they are still reliant on China for rare earths, but it's the commercial sector, not the defense sector. We specifically deal with the defense sector.
Wait, so I'm a little confused. It did collapse, or they are still reliant?
Yeah, that's what I was saying in the other answer before. So China specifically cut off Japan's entire commercial sector. It's different from the United States because our defense sector is only 1% of our total U.S.
Did China resume sending those exports to Japan?
Oh, yes, it did. Japan's now almost 100% reliant on China because they did not cut off their supply before that.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. I'm all out of time.
We'll be starting prep time. 5 minutes. Three minutes and 58 seconds. All right. If all my judges are set. Perfect. And the affirmative. Perfect. 8 minutes. Whenever we consider a policy regarding China, we have to understand that they are a country of similar caliber, regardless of whether we like it or not. They're not some small African country we can strong arm, but one that requires an in-depth investigation on what the current situation is to see if the paranoia is justified and if we can, or even should, do anything about it. I'd like to analyze this situation through the lens of two primary stock issues that comprise the burden that my partner Tony mentioned in his first speech. The idea of the affirmative team required to prove a harm in the status quo, and second, to prove that they actually solve that harm in the status quo. So let's jump right in with the idea of significance, asking the question of whether the affirmative team can show that there is a harm in the status quo. My first response, or my first significance argument, is that China won't cut the supply chain. China won't cut the supply chain. Now, the affirmative team has talked a lot about the fears of China cutting off rare earth elements from the United States, but they aren't likely to cut the supply chain from us. According to the South China Morning Post on July 21st of 2022, quote, "The West remains a key market for Chinese rare earth products, with many economic benefits to China maintaining this relationship, while the Western perspective seeks to reduce supply dependency, particularly amid worsening geopolitical relations," end quote. So China benefits with trade from the United States just as much as if not more, as we benefit. As such, it's very unlikely that China will cut off their supply chain anytime soon. Passing an incredibly aggressive policy to block out rare earth elements from China will only hurt us. Furthermore, there are actual legal implications from the WTO, the World Trade Organization, to ending these rare earth exports to the United States. This brings me to the second significance argument, that China still has to follow WTO guidelines. Again, China still has to follow WTO guidelines. This is according to Reuters on August 7th of 2014. Quote, "China lost in appeal at the World Trade Organization in a case brought by the United States, the European Union, and Japan to challenge China's restrictions on rare earths. China imposed strict export quotas in 2010, saying it was trying to curtail pollution and preserve resources. Prices soared by hundreds of percents, and the United States, EU, and Japan complained that the restrictions gave Chinese companies a competitive edge in products like hybrid car batteries, wind turbines, and energy-efficient lighting," end quote. So if China cuts off the supply of rare earth elements, then they will not only lose out on one of their biggest importers, but now they have to answer to the World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization has already mandated that China lift restrictions on exports in the past. That's why we see China lifted the restrictions on Japan in the first place. The simple answer is that China isn't likely to place restrictions on rare earth elements on the United States, as the affirmative team is claiming. There's no reason they should, and there is significant reasons why they shouldn't. The impact of this, if they do, is that China will severely jeopardize their economy if they do place a ban or a restriction on exports of rare earth elements to the United States. This is according to the European Trade Study Group that says, quote, "China's WTO ascension has also changed the global economic landscape. The Chinese economy has grown rapidly over the last 6 years and surpassed the UK to become the world's fourth largest economy. China has also become the world's largest trading country after the United States and the EU, and the country has also been one of the most popular destinations for foreign direct investment. End quote. Much of China's success is attributed to being part of the World Trade Organization. If they decide to violate the guidelines and restrict rare earth element exports, then they put their status as a member of the WTO at risk. The affirmative team hasn't really provided a real reason why China would do such a thing, besides the fact that they could possibly do such a thing. But the fact of the matter is, China won't and isn't likely to do that. So the harm of the affirmative team is severely overblown. But what about the second harm? The second idea of the United States not having a rare earth element supply? Well, this isn't exactly true. In the 1AC, she mentioned a stockpile, so I'd like to talk about that further. You can tag my next significance argument as a short-term stockpile. Again, a short-term stockpile. The Verge Technology stated in 2019, quote, if China did turn off the rare earth tap, there would be enough private and public stockpiles to supply essential sectors like the military in the short term, end quote. Regarding the idea of the stockpile, again, the United States has other alternatives instead of China, which is my next significance argument of further alternatives. According to Scientific American in 2019, quote, China currently has most of the world's separation facilities, but if it ever were to stop exporting the purified materials, other options exist. In the short term, US companies that rely on these minerals would likely have inventory stockpiles for brief supply shortages, Gold says, who served from 2010 to 2012 as a senior advisor to the Pentagon's Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Manufacturing and Industrial Base Policy. To stretch those stockpiles out, the overall market could prioritize rare earth elements for crucial applications such as military and medical technologies, end quote. So if China did decide to cut off rare earth elements exports to the United States, we can see the United States isn't in as dreadful of a situation as the affirmative claims. We have stockpiles in place and measures to stop the harm from occurring if it were to occur. The next significant argument is the idea that the United States isn't actually dependent on China. And my first subpoint is that the global market would survive. Again, the global market would survive. This is again according to Scientific American in 2019. Quote, as trade tensions rise between US and China, rare earth minerals are once again in the political spotlight. Today, Chinese mines and processing facilities provide most of the world's supply, and Chinese leader Xi Jinping has hinted about using this political leverage in trade negotiations with US President Donald Trump. But in the long run, many exporters say the global market involved these materials would likely survive, even if China completely stopped exporting them, end quote. Regarding the rare minerals, the United States doesn't need China. If they stopped exports right now, it wouldn't matter. The harm of Chinese control over rare earth elements isn't as significant as the affirmative mentions. We have a stockpile, we have enough. China shouldn't and wouldn't cut the United States off. China to us is the same as they are to them. Regarding the issue of Japan, the United States is not comparable to Japan. China has to be careful when they're ending exports with us. They haven't done it in the past, and there's no evidence that they'll do it again. I'd like to talk about the second burden that the affirmative has to uphold, the burden of solvency. Do they actually solve the problem in the status quo? Well, to answer this question, we have to ask ourselves, what makes these rare earth elements rare? Now, upon intuition, you might say, oh, well, there are not many of them in the world. But that's not very true. The Chinese monopoly is due to equipment, not resources. Again, the Chinese monopoly is due to equipment, not resources. According to Ariel Cohen and James C. Grant on June 22nd of 2021, quote, in the 2018, the U.S. Department of Interior identified 35 critical materials, 17 rare earth elements. Though these elements are considered rare, there's a misconception regarding their availability, despite the name commonly found in Earth's crust. However, extracting economically mineable concentrations is difficult, thus the relatively low supply, which ties into the impact that the United States has no means of processing rare earth materials. The United States has no means of processing rare earth minerals. According to Reuters, January 14th, 2022, quote, the United States only has one rare earth mine and has no capacity to process rare earth minerals, end quote. So sure, even if the United States has an abundance of rare earth elements, the whole harm of the affirmative still stands because China controls the manufacturing. They're the ones with the extraction tools to extract rare earth elements cheaply. Thus, the affirmative or after an affirmative ballot will still have to pay a hefty price if we want to obtain these minerals. Thanks.
All right. I've got 3 minutes on my clock if we're all ready to go.
All set.
Perfect. I'll go ahead and get started. Congratulations. I just had a couple questions for you. Starting off where we just left off. You would agree that in conjunction with Australia, the United States has about 3 processing facilities coming online in this year, correct?
I don't know if you read any evidence for that.
All right. So you would also agree that since the Trump administration and through the Biden administration, we have been creating a domestic rare earth element supply chain, correct?
Sure.
All right. And you talked about the stockpile, I believe, correct? How long will we last if China cut us off tomorrow with those stockpiles that you mentioned?
So I'm not sure, the card didn't say. It did say it was a short-term stockpile, however.
All right. And specifically looking at those cards that you did read, was any of your evidence specific to our defense sector?
Yes, it was. So there'd be enough, according to the Verge Technology in 2019, quote, if China did turn off the rare earth tap, there would be enough private and public stockpiles to supply essential sectors like the military in the short term. End quote.
All right, understood. Any other evidence besides that was relating directly to the defense sector?
Yeah, so the second card I read from Scientific American in 2019, quote, this is according to the Pentagon's Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Manufacturing and Industrial-Based Policy. He said, quote, to stretch these stockpiles out, the overall market could prioritize rare earth elements for crucial applications such as medical and military technologies, end quote.
Understood.
So yes.
But the negative team does not know how long that those could be stretched out for, correct?
No.
All right. And you would agree that the Japan cutoff was a commercial embargo by China?
Sure.
And you would also, are you aware of China's sanctioning of individual American defense contractors over the last 4 years?
I believe you mentioned it in the 1AC.
All right. And so how does that fit with the negative team's position that China won't cut off our supply chain when it comes to the defense?
So sure, China could sanction individual companies. I'm not sure the exact justification they had. I assume those fall under the WTO's justifications for doing so, but I don't exactly know the reason they did it. So I don't know the exact case of it.
Understood. So talking about the WTO specifically, does China follow the WTO's rules?
I'd say more often, yes, they do.
Let's take the example of artificial price gouging for an example.
Sure.
You would agree that historically they have a precedent of not abiding by the WTO's rules.
I don't think you've read any evidence of that.
All right. Do we always follow the WTO's rules?
I don't know.
All right. You would agree that all the rare earth elements that are currently in our stockpiles that you mentioned, we currently send all those minerals to China for processing, correct?
I don't know if you read any evidence stating that.
All right, thank you. No further questions.
Thanks.
I have 8 minutes on my timer for this next speech. And if you all are ready, perfect. Then I'll get started. Carl G. Schneider, senior materials scientist at Ames Laboratory, declares that, quote, American prosperity and stability and the world's strategic balance may well hang on the balance of the RE issue. If China consolidates its position and maintains a long-term monopoly of REs, then it will attain the level of the new and possibly sole superpower in the world in the coming decades, end quote. In an increasingly technological world, it's an unfortunate reality that many of us rely on rare earths for our day-to-day lives. But most importantly, our national security absolutely relies on rare earth elements provided to us by the People's Republic of China. And this is simply an unacceptable position for the United States to be in. I'd like to explore this through a few main points, starting out with point 1, detrimental reliance. Point 1, detrimental reliance. Al Jazeera noted in January of 2022 that, quote, in December, China consolidated several of its key producers to create a behemoth that will strengthen its control over the global industry it has dominated for decades, end quote. There is one thing I want you to take away from this. That is, without US governmental intervention, China will continue to dominate the rare earth sector. And this is a problem for our national security. Which brings me to subpoint B, that of a bedrock requirement. Subpoint B, a bedrock requirement. It is absolutely necessary for our national security that we have a reliable access to rare earth elements. But why is this a problem? This brings me to point 2 for you, a dangerous current system. Point 2, a dangerous current system. Subpoint A, you can write down as 90 days. Subpoint A, 90 days. Barbara Kellman and Alexander Stoner, research fellow and business analyst, write in September of 2022, quote, with no alternative to feed military apparatuses so far, North American producers of critical minerals estimate that should confrontation occur, China could cut short the supply of critical minerals to the US in an event of war and exhaust the US stock of minerals necessary for its defense apparatus in less than 90 days, end quote. Those stockpiles that the negative team was talking about in their last speech simply aren't enough to sustain the US military, especially because you can write my response down as stockpile unprocessed. Response stockpile unprocessed. Hwang-Min Kim, writing for the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy, University of Pennsylvania in September of 2021, says, quote, the U.S. national defense stockpile largely consists of unprocessed RE ores that still require Chinese refining, end quote. In other words, we are completely dependent on a predatory foreign adversary. But this brings me to subpoint B for you, a direct threat. Subpoint B, a direct threat. Now you can write my first response down as DOD equals 1%. Response DOD equals 1%. Now, Reuters published in May of 2019 that, quote, the U.S. Department of Defense accounts for about 1% of U.S. demand, end quote. In other words, the reasoning that he was stating that China won't cut our supply chain because it's economically beneficial to them simply doesn't stand in today's debate round, because our Department of Defense sector simply doesn't provide that economic benefit to the People's Republic of China. But in response to the idea of the WTO, you can write my response down as response WTO insufficient. Response WTO insufficient. Edward Alden, Bernard L. Schwartz, Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, writing in March of 2012, says, quote, the WTO dispute system can be extremely valuable because the panels serve as a neutral arbiter in assessing violations and calculating harm to the industries, but they cannot impose a solution, end quote. It's a fact known to everyone who lives in the world that nobody really pays attention to the WTO's guidelines, and certainly China doesn't. There is no reason to believe that China will absolutely abide by the WTO guidelines if it's in their interest to actually harm our national security. Which brings me to my third response for you, a direct, you can write this down as individual sanctions. Response 3, that of individual sanctions. Now, the problem is that our defense sector is uniquely at risk. Now, not only were there those 2019 and 2020 reports uncovered from Chinese officials, but from 2019 to 2023, China has actually sanctioned individual contractors, defense contractors, 4 separate times. Now, we need only look back to February of 2022, which was their third time sanctioning individual defense contractors, to see why this matters. Jeff Powell, writing in February of 2022, says, quote, we can also take other necessary steps, such as banning rare earth exports to Lockheed Martin. Although the U.S. has rare earths, it will take time to develop its supply chain, while China still owns the key processing technology of the minerals, it said, adding that Lockheed Martin's production would be affected by the sanctions, end quote. In other words, there is a unique risk to our defense sector, and we absolutely cannot rely on China because the free market cannot solve for us. As Maya Clark, writing for the Heritage Foundation, points out in February of 2021, quote, defense programs cannot afford the disruption that comes from market alignment, end quote. We cannot wait for China to cut off our defense programs and leave us stranded in 90 days. But this brings me to my third point for you. Point 3, a necessary solution. Point 3, a necessary solution. Now, he questioned the solvency of our plan, saying, is it actually possible that we can achieve our solution? I'd like to give you 2 subpoints. Subpoint A, an achievable solution. Subpoint A, an achievable solution. Now, as John Fang, writing in November of 2022, notes, in quote, in June, the mining company, which is referring to Lynas, was awarded a contract to build the first commercial heavy rare earth element separation facility in the U.S. Last year, as part of a separate agreement, Lynas was contracted to construct a light rare earth elements processing facility. Now, both projects, which are expected to come online in 2025, would be co-located in an industrial area on the Texas Gulf Coast, which could produce up to a quarter of the world's rare earth elements. With raw material being extracted from a Lynas mine in Mount Weld, Australia, and shipped to the US for refinement, the supply chain would bypass China, end quote. In other words, it is extremely achievable for us to take that 1% of DoD demand and then use the new processing capacity that is coming online in the next few years in order to satisfy it. In fact, as Laura Seligman points out, in December of 2022, quote, Mountain Pass alone will be able to fill all of DoD's rare earth needs, end quote. Now, Mountain Pass is the California mine that we have that actually produces rare earths at this very moment. Now, right now, yes, it is shipping every single ton it extracts to China for final processing, but this will end in the next few years, in which we will build up our domestic supply chain. But this brings me to subpoint B for you, a necessary solution. Subpoint B, a necessary solution. Now, if our solution is so achievable in the next few years, why do we need it? Now, this brings us back to the history of the 1980s. when we were brought from a position of net exporter of rare earths to a position of net importer simply because we let our supply chain implode. Now, Mary Hui, writing in April of 2021, referencing Dan McGrory, an advisory board member of USA Rare Earths, says, quote, the US government, by committing to buying from a particular domestic producer, would send a strong signal to capital markets. To have your own value chain, government support is required. The market cannot bring back the industry that you lost, end quote. In other words, it is absolutely necessary for us to not only build up our supply chain, but to support it with governmental support so that we don't experience a repeat of the 1980s. That is where we went from a position of net exporter and where other countries relied on us for their national security to a position of net importer, where we rely on China, a predatory foreign adversary, to supply us with the minerals that are needed for our national security. And it's for all these reasons, because we have an absolutely necessary and achievable solution, that we would ask for an affirmative ballot. Thank you. I'm now ready for any questions that the negative team may have.
All right. 3 minutes. You're all set. All right. So I want to talk about more of like a historical timeline. So you mentioned the 1980s, the United States used to be a net exporter, and then we were no longer a net exporter. Now, what was the primary factor behind this decision?
Of course, so the primary factor behind this decision was private companies' decisions of lowest cost at any cost, as we quoted in our first affirmative constructive. That is, they went with China's cheaper prices.
That includes defense contractors like Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman.
Exactly, which is why our policy is needed in order for them to switch over from China to the United States supply chain.
Okay, interesting. Now, you mentioned several instances of the China sanctioning the United States defense contractors. Did they just threaten to sanction them, or did they actually sanction them?
They did actually sanction them. They have not sanctioned rare earths yet, though, although they have threatened to, which shows that they are perfectly willing and capable.
Wait, so they sanctioned the companies, but they haven't sanctioned rare earth elements?
They sanctioned the companies for materials that were something other than rare earth elements.
Oh, but not specifically rare earth elements.
No, but they have stated, the Chinese government has actually stated that they could cut rare earth exports to these companies if they so desired.
Okay, they could, but just to make it clear, they have never sanctioned rare earth elements from the United States military.
Of course, but the fact that they have not done it yet does not mean that they will not do so in the future.
Okay, interesting. I want to talk about the idea of the WTO being inefficient, and you talked about how it's not. Did you provide a warrant for that claim, or did you just read a card from someone saying that it isn't?
I actually did provide a warrant for that claim, because I can look back at the credentials if you want me to.
I'm not looking at the credentials. I'm looking for a warrant. Why is the WTO ineffective?
Of course, so the WTO is ineffective because it really doesn't have an enforcement policy that is really effective on a world stage. And a lot of countries ignore actually the WTO's guidelines on a number of different occasions,
If the
such as China with price gouging.
Okay, if the WTO is ineffective, then how come China listened to them and removed the restrictions for Japanese rare earth elements?
Of course, so China removed the restrictions on Japanese rare earth elements, well, because it really determined that it was in its best interest to do so. It really just wanted to threaten the Japanese government.
It was in their best interest to do so. Okay. Now, is it your contention with the new processing plants that we're building that will no longer be reliant on China after 2 years?
With the processing plants that are coming online, we no longer have to be reliant on China for our Department of Defense demands specifically.
Okay, just for the DoD.
That is what we are called to, what we have a burden to prove in today's debate round, and I believe we have done so.
Okay, now how much can this process? How much can these facilities, do their thing?
So the evidence stated that the facilities can process up to a quarter of the world's demand as of right now, as of today, for rare earths.
Okay, do you know how much of that compares to U.S. demand regarding our military?
Of course. So United States demand is about 9% of the world market, and then Department of Defense demand is 1% of the US's demand. So it certainly covers that.
Okay, thanks so much.
All right, my timer set for 3 minutes and 58 seconds, and we'll start our prep time now.
If you could send me that WTO card, that'd be great. Thanks.
No further prep time is necessary. We have 1 minute and 46 seconds remaining. My timer. Sorry, my computer just had an update. My timer is set for 8 minutes. And assuming everybody's all set, great. Then I will go ahead and begin. Good intentions do not equal sound policy. And that's the philosophy of the negative team today. My partner and I agree with the intentions of the affirmative team. They want to stop our reliance. They want to stop us from being dependent on an awful country like China. We understand all of those intentions, but we would simply make the case that while their intentions are excellent, it hasn't actually equated to sound policy. Their policy simply isn't well thought out and is completely unnecessary. All their policy will do is cause disadvantages to the United States and the defense sector in specific. And I'll be proving that through 2 main points. First, let's talk about inherency. So my main point under this is going to be that Japan was completely fine. You see, I asked in cross-examination, what was the impact of China cutting off that trade to Japan? My opponent said it was absolutely terrible for Japan, but her partner didn't read any more evidence confirming that. Let's look at other people analyzing the situation. You can tag my first subpoint, subpoint A, as Japan cut off incentivized change. China cut off incentivized change. China cut off incentivized change. So essentially, according to CNBC, reported in June of 2019, quote, when Beijing slashed in shipments in 2010, prices for rare earths jumped, creating an incentive for other countries to increase production. The measures also destroyed demand, as the manufacturers found ways to use fewer rare earth minerals in their products, end quote. So essentially what that piece of evidence is saying is that when China did that to Japan, the demand went completely destroyed. That means that people didn't actually need these rare earth minerals nearly as much as before, because Japan realized, well, we won't be able to get them from China. We have to have other methods. That brings me to subpoint B. Japan set up new investments. According to the Center for Strategic and International Studies in 2020, quote, Beijing's most notable use of rare earths as a political tool came in 2010 amid a heated dispute with Tokyo. After Japan arrested the captain of a Chinese fishing boat that rammed a Japanese Coast Guard vessel, China restricted rare earth exports to Japan for 2 months. The impact on Japan's supply chains was limited, but it highlighted the country's reliance on China for more than 80% of its rare earth imports. Tokyo quickly took steps to limit future supply chain disruptions. In 2011, Japan's Sojitz Corporation and government-owned Japan Oil, Gas, and Metals National Corporation invested $250 million in Australian miner Lynas Corporation. The financial boost helped Lynas to become the only supplier outside of China capable of processing rare earths, and the company now supplies Japan with nearly 1/3 of its rare earth imports, end quote. So essentially what all this evidence is saying is that first off, it wasn't actually that significant to Japan. Their economy didn't collapse, as the affirmative team said. That didn't happen whatsoever. It said their supply chain wasn't even that shocked. But it did highlight to Japan that something needed to change. And that brings me to my third and final subpoint, subpoint C. Japanese ban had little effect. According to the Verge Technology News website in 2019, quote, the question is, what happens if China does cut off the US? Luckily, we have a very good idea of what would happen next because it's already happened before. Back in 2010, China stopped exports of rare earths to Japan following a diplomatic incident. Goals wrote a report of the fallout from this incident in 2014 and found that despite China's intentions, its ban actually had little effect. Chinese smugglers continued to export rare earths off the books, manufacturers in Japan found ways to use less of the materials, and production in other parts of the world ramped up to compensate. The world is so flexible, Goals said. When you try to restrict supplies to politically influence another country, people don't give up, they adapt. He says that although his report examined the rare earth industry as it was in 2010, the conclusions are pretty much the same in 2019. End quote. What all of this evidence is saying, and this is in tandem with my partner's evidence, saying that if they were to completely cut off our exports, we would be completely fine, just like Japan was in 2010. Once again, their economy did not collapse, as the affirmative team said. It was actually completely fine. But it did do something positive and made Japan realize, well, even though we weren't that impacted, we don't want to risk too big of an impact. So they started investing. And this really brings me to my main disadvantage: increasing prices for no reason. The reason why I'm going to be talking about this is because my partner explained how we would be able to go to Australia and Japan if we had these rare earths cut off. And I'll reread this evidence. According to CNBC in June of 2019, quote, a complete ban on rare earth exports to the US is not practical because American companies can secure supplies from countries such as Malaysia and Japan. although at much higher costs, end quote. So essentially what that evidence is saying is that Japan, and in this instance Malaysia, were successful at ending their reliance on China, and they were able to create their own processing facilities. So if China were to stop all of its exports to the United States or to the Department of Defense itself, either one, we would be able to purchase all of these rare earth minerals from other industries. Well, where's the disadvantage? The disadvantage in that is that our evidence said very clearly that it would be at a much higher cost. We would be able to get everything we need essentially. We would get all the essential things, but it would do it at a much higher cost. Why would we do this at a much higher cost when we are going to not be reliant on them in just 2 years? You see, that's what our opponents' evidence said. They said in 2 years we won't need anything from them. So why would we end our partnership with them that allows us to get cheap rare earth minerals now when in just 2 years we'll be completely independent from them? And additionally, it doesn't matter if those 2 years happen, because even if they were to cut us off at some point, our supply chain would be completely fine as it was with Japan. We would completely be able to recover. And I'd like to talk a little bit more about this aspect of it really only harming us. The reason why it would only harm us is because we cannot produce rare earths currently. According to Forbes News magazine in February of 2021, quote, given that Lynas has yet to announce when its Texas plant will begin operation, domestic REE processing capability won't be available soon. The Department of Energy confirms that U.S. is currently lacks the domestic capability to separate REE concentrations into REOs. According to public sourcing, there is one processing plant, a small pilot plant soon to be operational in Colorado, but it's more or less an experiment, end quote. But what's more important to note is that the U.S. has been trying. According to the Conservative Coalition for Climate Solutions, stated in May of 2021, quote, but there are strong signs that the U.S. government is now fully engaged to solve the problem. President Biden in February signed an executive order to take a 100-day review of the most important changes needed to strengthen domestic supply chains. And in late December, former President Trump signed a $2 trillion pandemic spending package that included $800 million to better fund geological studies on federal land and improve the processing and recycling of rare earths, end quote. So what all of this evidence is saying, what all of the evidence that I've read has said is that first off, Japan was completely fine. They actually created their own processing plants. Now, if China were to cut us off from rare earth minerals, it's true. We won't be able to make our own rare earth minerals until 2022. The reason why that doesn't matter is because we'll be able to go to Japan and Malaysia, except for an increased cost. But that isn't that big of a deal. If China cuts us off, we'll be able to get all of our rare earth minerals because we can buy it more expensive until 2025. And then after 2025, we will be able to make all of our own minerals. I'd like to read one final piece of evidence summing this idea up perfectly. According to the Kleinman Center for Security Policy of Pennsylvania University in 2021, quote, mining and refining of REEs within the United States are still largely in the pilot phase, and Australia remains the only major producer besides China. Hence, the Chinese REE monopoly will continue in the short term and gradually abate as both the United States and other countries develop their own rare earth element supply chains, likely by pooling data and best practices, end quote. So it's true. China does have a monopoly, and that now we are able to get the cheapest price from them, and that is the best place to go. But in just a few years, we will no longer be reliant on anyone. We'll be able to have all of our minerals that we need. Why, for those 2 years, should we be paying far more increased costs for these rare earth elements? There's absolutely no reason for it. There's no national security risk. We'll be able to get our rare earth elements from Japan and other countries. All they're doing is jacking up prices. As for all these reasons, we agree with their intentions. We don't agree with their policy. Thank you.
I have 3 minutes on my timer. Great, then I'll get started. I just have a couple of questions about your last speech. So starting off with, wouldn't you agree that China cut off Japan's commercial sector? Is that correct?
I believe so. I'm not entirely sure, but sure.
Okay, perfect. And then didn't your evidence state that the fact that they cut off Japan's commercial sector shows that countries need to separate from China?
It also said that their supply chains were largely unaffected. So it said both of those things, but the general was a negative impact. I'm sorry, a negligible impact.
Of course. Now, didn't the United States actually look at Japan's instance in 2010 and decide that, per the evidence that you read from the Biden administration, that we need to actually break away from Chinese reliance?
Absolutely. And we'll be operational within 2 years. No reason to pay more for rare earth elements for those last 2 years.
Of course. And then just clarifying one thing about our plan, you do realize that our ban goes into effect after 2026.
Sure. Then in that case, we won't be reliant on them anyway. So there's no issue with this ban existing.
Okay,
there's no need for the ban.
Okay, so it is the negative team's contention that we can then build up our supply chain and that our supply chain will just survive.
Well, that's what all of our advocates are saying. Even now, without any ban, if China were to cut everything off, we'd be completely fine. In 2 years, we'll be completely fine. There's no need for an affirmative ballot.
Okay. Now, in your last speech, did you read any evidence regarding the defense sector of the United States specifically?
No, I believe the fact that they was talking about the commercial sector is honestly more impactful, because if China were to cut off everything from us and we'd still be fine, then that obviously includes the defense sector.
Okay. And then talking about that CNBC article that said if there was a complete ban, we could actually go to other countries. Now, did the CNBC article state how much those other countries would cover?
No, it said that Malaysia and Japan are two we could rely on. I'm not sure if it specified how much reliance that would be.
Did it state that those countries currently have a full supply chain that would completely bypass China?
It didn't 100% say that, but it seems like we don't need that, because you're only doing it for the Department of Defense. We don't need a whole bypass for our whole sector. We just need it for the defense.
Okay, perfect. So is it the negative team's contention that if China weren't bluffing and were to cut off our defense sector, we would be completely fine?
We would have to pay more for our rare earth elements, but essentially we would be fine. We just have to pay more.
Okay, so it's the negative team's contention that we could just automatically switch over from one supply chain to another?
It's not our contention. It's a contention of our advocates, which we've both read multiple.
Okay, perfect. And then last question for you. Do you trust China?
Not inherently, no.
Okay, great. Thank you for your answers.
I think you might be muted.
You're muted.
I have 5 minutes on the clock if all my judges are set. All right. I'd like to take you back to the burden that the affirmative team must uphold. First, they must show that there's a significant problem in the status quo. Second, they need to show that they solve that problem. And third, they need to show more advantages than disadvantages. And throughout this speech, I'd like to point holes inside each of these burdens and show you why the affirmative doesn't really uphold either of these three stock issues. Regarding the idea of significance, is the problem actually significant in the status quo? And it's Tony and I's contention that the problem isn't as significant as the affirmative would point out. First, the idea of the World Trade Organization. Now, the negative team or the affirmative team came here and said, well, no one listens to the WTO, but they just read an expert saying that they didn't provide any warrant for why people don't listen to the WTO. On the other hand, I read 3 separate pieces of evidence that China does in fact care and listen to the WTO. There's simply no warrant for the affirmative to claim that. China lost a WTO appeal when they sanctioned rare earth elements to Japan. And as a result, they listened. They listened to the decision the World Trade Organization did, and they removed export restrictions on rare earth elements to Japan. The World Trade Organization is the only reason that China is so powerful as it is today. They're responsible for increasing China's influence significantly. That wasn't contested. Neither was the evidence that I read stating that China does listen to the World Trade Organization. Neither was a card saying that they have listened to the World Trade Organization. The affirmative team didn't read evidence to contest any of this, only a claim made by the expert with no warrant. The second idea is that the stockpiles are actually significant. The stockpiles are actually significant. I'd like to reread some of the evidence that I read in my first affirmative speech, or first negative speech. I said, quote, and while an embargo could lead to price rises for high technology goods, someone that works within the Pentagon said it's highly unlikely that you would be unable to buy these things for military purposes in the short term. They also neglected the piece of evidence that I read regarding further alternatives from the same person, the Pentagon's Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Manufacturing and Industrial-Based Policy, that says, quote, to stretch those stockpiles out, the overall market could prioritize rare earth elements for crucial applications such as military and medical technologies, end quote. This comes from someone directly inside the government saying that China, if they cut off rare earth elements exports to the United States, it wouldn't do much because we have enough of a stockpile for it. The idea that the United States is not dependent on China, again, the evidence that I read went uncontested that said, quote, in the long run, many experts say the global market involving these materials would likely survive, even if China completely stopped exporting them, end quote. Simply put, these stockpiles are sufficient, as said by numerous experts in the field. Now, regarding the idea of the impact on the United States and our defense industry, we can see that it didn't actually do very much damage to Japan. My partner Tony talked extensively about that. And Japan is a much smaller country than the United States, and as such, the impacts would be much smaller comparatively on the United States, as the United States has a larger stockpile of rare earth elements than Japan. So the little damage it did to Japan, it'll do less to the United States. Now, regarding the idea of, China sanctioning individual defense contractors, we can write my response as there's no sanction on rare earth elements. China sanctioning US defense, that's natural, that's normal, that's something you'd expect. We aren't exactly on the best terms in terms of countries, but the affirmative team hasn't provided the link between that and a sanction on rare earth elements. They haven't provided a single instance of China cutting off rare earth elements from the United States military, or in any case, any country. The only example they presented is Japan. And we see that 1, it did little harm, 2, it wasn't to their military, and 3, China listened to the World Trade Organization and lifted those export bans. If anything, it solidifies my argument about how China purposely avoids sanctioning the United States rare earth elements for our military, either in fear of the WTO or US retaliation. The idea that the United States will be reliant in the next 2 years actually flows negative. After we become dependent, why do we just cut off from China? Why not continue to receive the cheap imports? And if they do cut off, why have production? Why do we need to end cheap rare earth element imports the second we have a domestic base? And it's interesting because it brings up 2 situations. 1, either China cuts rare earth element imports before we're independent, which won't really do anything because, again, we're sufficient. Or 2, China cuts rare earth element imports after we become dependent, meaning there's no reason for an affirmative policy, no reason to ban that cheap rare earth elements. Regarding the idea of the DoD only needing 1%, again, this ties into the fact that there is no significance for the affirmative policy. If they only need a tiny percent of the rare earth elements, then China cutting off rare earth elements from our defense does even less. The less rare earth elements the DoD needs, the less significant the impact is. If you really believe that China will spontaneously end rare earth elements within the next 2 years, and the United States has the ability to recontrol an industry China has dominated for 40 years in 3, and somehow save money doing that, vote affirmative. But I don't think any of that's true. Thus, I urge you to vote negative.
All right. We're all ready to go? Perfect. I've got 5 minutes on my clock. Awesome. We can go ahead and get started. The risks today cannot be overstated. And what I want you to remember at the end of today's round is this. When it comes to national security, rare earth elements are not a comfort. They are not a privilege, they are an absolute necessity. And today, to acquire those materials which are so vital to protecting our nation from military threat, we rely almost entirely on a foreign government. And in this case, a foreign adversary. China's weak point is innovation, and that is where the US thrives. The point of our plan was never to create a domestic supply chain because, quite frankly, as we've proven through evidence, one already exists in its infancy within the status quo. It's to require action to be taken as a result of a set policy. We do not use Chinese rare earths in our weapons defense systems. I want to get into a couple responses to the negative team's concerns, starting with response supply chain concerns. Response supply chain concerns. You can write this down as defense sector equals 1% of US demand. Defense sector equals 1% of US demand. Now, Emma read evidence about this in her first speech, directly stating that the U.S. military's demand could be easily satisfied by non-Chinese production because this need represents less than 5% of the total market. The negatives point about essentially this not being the case might make sense if we were cutting off the entire commercial sector. We are not under our plan. We've made that clear. That's why the evidence that they've read to you in general refers to the commercial sector, not the defense sector. Just the 1% that the DoD accounts for is what we're talking about under our plan. It is an achievable solution. It is a significant problem. All the negative team has done against all the numbers we've given about how this is achievable is not provided evidence against those claims, but other arguments about the WTO and Japan's economic cutoff, which was relating to the entire commercial sector. This leads us to a response to Australia and the US can bypass. Australia and the US can bypass. Now, look, I'm just going to reference back to this evidence because Emma already brought it up in her last speech, and it simply went uncontested to. The reality is that Australia's Linus Rare Earths has been brought in to help shore up America's supply of critical minerals. In June, they were awarded a $120 million contract to build the first commercial heavy rare earth element separation facility in the United States, with raw material being extracted from a Linus mine in Mount Weld, Australia, and shipped to the US for refinement. The supply chain would bypass China. Laura Siegelman stated in 2022 that Mountain Pass alone will be able to fulfill all the DoD's needs. Now, the important thing to realize about this is that when the processing facilities come online by 2025, they're already under contract with Mountain Pass to have the minerals sent there for processing. You see, the supply chain already exists in its infancy. But this leads us to point number one, need a set policy. Need a set policy. We agree with the negative team. We are currently pursuing domestic policies to build up our supply chain. We've been doing that for years. All of the actions of the United States domestically mean nothing if we don't have a set policy in place that tells defense contractors they can't simply go with China's cheaper prices and ease of purchase, but have to turn to our infant supply chain. In addition, in order to survive, our supply chain needs buyers, making this the perfect time to pass our policy. If our domestic supply chain is ready, why do we need this policy? Well, because our defense contractors continue to go with this philosophy of the lowest cost at any cost. That changes today under our plan. The negative team characterized this policy as not well thought out. We would argue the opposite. We've been sitting around thinking about it for decades, waiting for disaster to strike. This leads us to point number two, unacceptable threat. Point number two, unacceptable threat. I'll point you back to the first affirmative constructive. 90 days is how long the United States defense industry would last in terms of a Chinese cutoff of rare earths to it. A Bloomberg report in 2019 indicated that China had drawn up plans to restrict rare earth exports to the United States. In addition, in 2011, China cut off REE exports to Japan's entire REE sector, but suffered massive economic losses. According to Business Korea in 2023, in fact, the Chinese government already limited its exports against Japan during the Senkaku disputes in 2010. Despite Japan's supply source diversification efforts, its current dependence on imported REEs is still 100%, and that imported from China accounts for more than 60% of the imports, unquote. The negative team's last point about the fact that Japan was not economically harmed by the sanctions is absolutely inaccurate. In addition, the Chinese commercial cutoff to Japan hurt them economically, as the negative team insinuated in their first speech that such a ban would. That's why they backed out, not just because of the WTO, an unproven claim by NEG. The defense sector does not provide that same economic concern due to its size. And as China has proven time and time again, that makes it the perfect leverage point, potentially leaving us crippled in 90 days in terms of defense if we continue to go ahead without our policy forcing defense contractors to turn to our infant supply chain. 2 months ago, they sanctioned American defense contractors Lockheed Martin and Raytheon for the fourth time. I'm not sure how brazen China needs to be before we start taking them seriously. That's what we do under our plan today. And I would ask you to vote affirmative. Thank you.
Timer set for 1 minute and 46 seconds. And I'll start that now. All right. My prep time has expired. We've got 5 minutes on my timer. I'll go ahead and begin. Their good intentions do not equate to sound policy. They want to do good things. We agree with those good things. It doesn't actually be met by their policy. Their plan is not solved. Now I have a few points into this. My first point you can tag as not reliant on China, not reliant on China. There is absolutely no need for an affirmative ballot because their plan simply isn't, their plan simply isn't necessary because we aren't reliant on China whatsoever. I have a few subpoints of this. Subpoint A, stockpile. Now, there has been a lot of different evidence brought about this. My partner and I both brought up pieces of evidence saying that the stockpile is sufficient. Our opponents also both brought up pieces of evidence saying that it was only for 90 days. Now, regardless of whether that stockpile is for 90 days or not, we did read our advocate saying that it was sufficient. But let's say that was a stalemate. Let's say that doesn't go to either team. That brings me to my second subpoint. Subpoint B, other avenues. Well, I believe they read a piece of evidence saying that Australia wouldn't be able to supply. That doesn't respond to the fact that I read a piece of evidence saying that we would be able to get all of our needs from Japan and Malaysia, only at an increased cost. So even if China were to cut everything off today, as all of our evidence has been assuming, they would cut all rare earth minerals off. So we would need even more than that 1% that they're talking about. All of our evidence has said that the world will adjust. We are not significantly reliant on it because there are other avenues. That was my third subpoint. Subpoint C, past precedent. Now, and this is where I really like to talk about this Japan example. Our opponents brought up a piece of evidence saying that it was important to Japan. However, that goes directly against my previous evidence saying that it wasn't actually that significant. I'd like to reread that. According to the Verge Technology news website in 2019, quote, the world is flexible. When you try to restrict supplies to politically influence another country, people don't give up, they adapt. He says that although this report examined the rare earth industry as it was in 2010, conclusions are pretty much the same in 2019, end quote. And what that evidence was saying is that it didn't actually affect their supply chain that significantly. So while their commercial industry may have been harmed, their supply chain wasn't hurt significantly. Therefore, our defense industry, which uses only 1%, would not be harmed significantly. And that actually brings me to my fourth subpoint, subpoint D, DOD only 1%. DOD only 1%. Now, the affirmative team kind of argued against themselves in their last speech. They're saying we're so reliant, and then they're also saying we only need 1% of our requirements to be met to keep supplying the military. If we only need 1% of these rare earth minerals that we are actually using to fuel the our domestic military, then there's absolutely no reason for an affirmative ballot. We've already seen that if they were to cut off all exports, we would be completely fine. We'd go through other avenues. If they were to only reduce it by 1% and it's only the DOD that we need these things for, we will absolutely be able to supply. So we are not reliant on China whatsoever. And that is simply a fact. Now, as you know, my second point, only increasing cost. Now, I have a few subpoints of this. Subpoint A, domestic industry, fine. Now, our opponents essentially made the argument that even though this ban only goes into place after 2026, in which case we will be completely able to make all of our rare earth elements and already we will be independent from them. They said that, well, we need to ensure that the domestic industry has different buyers. Well, that's simply not true. No evidence has actually said the domestic industry needs to have buyers. I read multiple pieces of evidence saying that President Biden and Donald Trump have actually passed new policies trying to fuel all of this domestic industry, and they provided hundreds of millions of dollars in totals of billions that to encourage this domestic industry. They didn't read any evidence saying that it needs consumers. But if China is actually that big of a threat and they do choose to move away from us, we still have this domestic industry. And all of their evidence has been saying this domestic industry will be able to be available in 2026. None of it says we can't buy from China if we want this domestic industry to thrive. They didn't read a single piece of evidence saying that. That's very important. That was my second point. So point B, paying more for Japan. Let's say this was true. Let's say that we do need to cut off to move to this domestic industry. That wouldn't actually mean anything because we would still just go to Japan and Malaysia. There's absolutely no significance with an affirmative ballot. My third subpoint C, no sanctions. Our opponents keep trying to say that these sanctions actually happened. They simply didn't. They may have sanctioned in other areas. They did not happen in regards to rare earth minerals. What is the reason for this? Well, one reason might be the World Trade Organization, which my opponents essentially dropped. They didn't respond to my partner's evidence saying that China listened to the World Trade Organization. Our opponents tried to say, well, it was because of China's own interests. That's not what the evidence said. It was because they lost their World Trade Organization filing. So we see that it's very unlikely for this to happen, and they're only going to be increasing costs. In the years that this plan will actually take effect, the United States will already have its own independent rare earth mineral supply chain. The affirmative team confirmed that. What's wrong with us getting cheap earth minerals when we can? And then if we aren't able to, then we can just go to more expensive sources through Japan, Malaysia, or in the timeline of the affirmative team's plan, our own domestic producers. At the end of the day, there's no real reason for an affirmative ballot, and there's been no substantiated harm. Thank you.
I have 5 minutes on my timer. Perfect. And if you all are ready, great. Then I'll go ahead and get started. Carl G. Schneider, senior materials scientist at Ames Laboratory, concludes his advocacy for separation from China with, quote, "In the end, REs may be equivalent to future world domination if one country continues to control virtually all of RE production. The near future may be America's best and possibly last chance to alter the RE equation for the benefit of itself and the entire world," end quote. Antonio asked at the end of his last speech, why can't we just leave our policy the way it is? Well, I'll answer him with history. In the 1980s, we let American defense contractors diversify away from the US supply chain. And what happened? We became a net importer of rare earths and became reliant wholly on a predatory foreign adversary. That is exactly why Lucy and I are calling for a set policy that US defense contractors cannot work with China at any point in the RE supply chain. This is why our policy is necessary. And I'd like to cover this through a few voting issues, starting out with voting issue 1, reliant on adversary. Voting issue 1, reliant on adversary. Now, Antonio claimed in his last speech that we are not reliant on China, but I'd like to point out one thing. The negative team has not read any piece of evidence regarding the defense sector specifically that says that our defense sector would be fine if China cut us off. What Lucy and I have read to you is number 1, our stockpile is unprocessed, so it cannot cover for us. That number 2, we would be left helpless in 90 days. And number 3, that our defense cannot afford the disruption that would come from free market realignment. In all of those cases, we have proven to you through evidence read into the round that our defense sector cannot afford the disruption that maybe the commercial sector could solve. Our defense sector needs reliable access to our rare earth elements as stated by the Department of itself, that it is a bedrock requirement of the DoD. But this brings me to my second voting issue for you too. Voting issue 2 of a weaponized commodity. Voting issue 2, a weaponized commodity. Now, he claimed in his last speech that Japan wasn't really hurt by the fact, but we've told you ever since the first 1AC that Japan was actually harmed economically. As Nicole Claggett, writing for the Journal of Energy and Environmental Law in summer of 2013, says, quote, "Within only 10 days, Japan's economy was in jeopardy because it lacked access to the rare earths necessary to continue industrial production," end quote. And in fact, China pulled out, as Lucy stated in her last speech, pulled out of the Japan embargo because it was hurting China economically. So all of the affirmative team's objections to Japan do not apply in this situation because number 1, again, it actually did harm Japan, but number 2 is that China does not have the same concerns when it comes to the defense sector of the United States. But furthermore, he said that really, well, the fact they haven't actually sanctioned individual defense contractors yet. And yes, that is true. But what they have done is they have threatened to limit rare earth exports to these specific defense contractors. We have a past precedent of aggression here. And the fact that we are in this position at all is an unacceptable position for us to be in, because the negative team is just sleeping by Mount Vesuvius, feeling the earthquakes underneath them and thinking it's fine. The mountain is never going to blow. But the fact is that we cannot be in this situation as a sovereign nation, where we completely rely on a predatory foreign adversary for our national security. Now, he also stated that the Department of Defense is only 1%. And again, we've already combated this, saying that we would be left helpless in 90 days. But this brings me to my third voting issue for you. Voting issue 3, national security preserved. Voting issue 3, national security preserved. Now, I'd like you to note 2 things underneath this. That first, we have an achievable solution, and secondly, we have a necessary solution. In their last speech, they didn't actually combat any of the evidence that Lucy and I read, stating that our solution was actually effective in the current system, meaning that this point flows affirmative. But so point B is that it is a necessary solution. Again, they didn't really address the logic in the WTO card that I read, saying that the WTO actually cannot provide a solution. And in fact, China, as we all know, actually disregards world standards frequently in its practices. So I don't believe that the WTO would actually stop China from this fact, as my evidence also stated. But the fact is that what they said at their last speech is that really there is no reason to pass the affirmative team's plan is simply untrue. Lucy and I have detailed to you through 22 separate pieces of evidence that we are completely reliant on a predatory foreign adversary for rare earth elements which are critical to our national security. But secondly, that it is also necessary for us to break away from this Chinese reliance because history repeats itself. if we do not set a set policy saying that we cannot go for the lowest cost at any cost. We will only be shooting ourselves in the foot and continuing to last underneath China's stranglehold. Thank you, and it's been a pleasure speaking for you today.
Thank you all so much for judging. Great job with the affirmative team.
Yeah.
Yes,
Good
thank you
round,
all so
guys.
much for your time to judge, and great round, you guys. Congratulations.
Thank
Thanks,
you all so much.
Have a
everyone.
great night, everyone.
Yeah. Thank you, guys.
Can everyone hear and see me okay now? All right. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Nathan Chen. I'll be your negative speaker today. Thank you all so much for your time.
All right, perfect. So if everybody can hear and see me okay as well, awesome. And I've got 6 minutes on my timer if we're all ready to begin. Perfect. Then let's get started. Quote, human rights are not a privilege conferred by government. They're every human being's entitlement by virtue of his humanity. End quote. Mother Teresa. Human rights are the foundation of our society, and it is for this reason that I affirm that an individual's right to property ought to be valued above the economic interests of the community. Now, before I explain specifically why, I'd like to clarify three main terms that I will use in today's round. The first term you can tag as the right to property, the right to property. According to the Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at Auburn University, this is, quote, the right to private property authorizes persons to use what they own as they see fit, provided it does not invade the rights of others. End quote. My second definition is that of the interests of the community. The interests of the community. Cambridge defines a community as, quote, the people living in Now, for clarification's sake, is it preferred that I restart my speech from the beginning or resume at the 5 minutes and 8 seconds at which I paused it?
I don't believe that I heard more than about 10 seconds. So I personally would prefer that we restart entirely, if that's all right with everyone else.
Yes, I would say the same.
Fine with me.
All right, Mr. Miller, can you hold the room, please? We're still working with Judge Miller to make sure he gets back on. Thank you. Mr. Miller, can you see and hear the debaters? All right, we have confirmation from Mr. Miller that he can see and hear, so you guys are good to proceed.
Awesome.
One last reminder, if you're an observer, please leave the room and observe on ncfca.org/live. Only people that should be in here are the competitors and judges. Thank you so much.
I'll be restarting my speech at 6 minutes from the top. If everybody's ready. Awesome, then here we go again. Quote, human rights are not a privilege conferred by government. They're every human being's entitlement by virtue of his humanity, end quote. Mother Teresa. Human rights are the foundation of our society, and it is for this reason that I affirm that an individual's right to private property ought to be valued above the economic interests of the community. Now, before I explain specifically why, there's a couple of terms I'd like to clarify. The first term you can tag as the right to property, the right to property. Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at Auburn University defines it saying, quote, the right to private property authorizes persons to use what they own as they see fit, provided it does not invade the rights of others, end quote. My second definition, you can tag as the interests of the community, the interests of the community. Cambridge defines a community as, quote, the people living in one particular area or people who are considered as a unit because of their common interests, end quote. And because economic is an adjective in today's resolution, this will just be applied at an economic level. My third and final definition, you can tag as the purpose of government, the purpose of government. The primary purpose of government is to protect people's rights. We see this according to the Constitutional Rights Foundation, which says, quote, the purpose of government, Locke wrote, is to secure and protect the God-given, inalienable natural rights of the people, end quote. So now that we understand what the resolution is talking about, let's dive deeper into the res itself. I'll do this through 2 points of resolutional analysis. The first point you can tag as the resolution requires a conflict of interest. The resolution requires a conflict of interest. Today we're debating a situation of conflict where we can't have both sides. It's when self-interest is contrary to the interests of the community. So for example, let's say a farmer has land that blocks the plan for a time-saving road. In the economic interest of the community, his land would be seized and the road built. But by prioritizing rights, the farmer could keep his hard-worked land. In my second point of resolutional analysis, we see limitation versus violation. Limitation versus violation. For clarification, a limitation is when there's proper justification to restrict a right, while a violation is when there's no fair justification. For example, the police can't arrest you for having the appearance of someone who might do something bad. They need just cause, just as the government needs just cause to limit or restrict rights. And this is reflected in my anti-value, or essentially what I'm going to try to be avoiding in today's debate round. You could take the affirmative anti-value as a violation of human rights. A violation of human rights. The standard of the round is to avoid an objectively wrong principle, the violation of human rights. Rather than prioritizing something to no end, my anti-value aims to clarify the role of government. Protection. As Nelson Mandela said, quote, to deny people their human rights is to challenge their very humanity, end quote. We must avoid the violation of human rights. So stand with me to protect these inherent rights by upholding my value through the criterion of just government. Just government. To quote the Declaration of Independence, quote, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, end quote. The foundation of our country explains it perfectly. To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Therefore, a just government must avoid violating human rights, even when violating those rights would be beneficial for the general economy. And this leads me to my first contention. which you can tag as the right to property is a human right. The right to property is a human right. The resolution itself refers to property as property rights, but we also know that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 17, lists it as one, stating, quote, everyone has the right to own property alone, as well as in association with others. No one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his property, end quote. That means the choice we're given today is one between intrinsic human rights or the interests of the community, where it would be clearly unethical to say that property rights should be valued any less. As John Locke said in the second treatise of government, quote, government has no other end but the preservation of property, end quote. And this is why I stand by my second contention, which you can tag as just governments must uphold property rights. Just governments must uphold property rights. I've already established that the purpose of government is to uphold human rights. And since property rights are clearly human rights, a just government must then uphold property rights. Proof of this could be seen in the case of Kelo versus New London. In this example, the city of New London used eminent domain to seize the property of Miss Kelo and several of her neighbors to transfer it to the private developer, Pfizer. They justified their action, claiming it would benefit the community's economic interest. However, the company went bankrupt, and the land taken became a vacant lot. This shows that no good comes from the government failing its purpose intentionally by prioritizing the economic interest of the community over the human rights of its citizens. In conclusion, we see the government's duty is to uphold human rights, according to the Declaration of Independence itself. This means that even when violating or sacrificing the rights of an individual would benefit the general economy, the government must choose to uphold human rights in order to justly fulfill its intended purpose and duty. It's also clear that private property is a human right. So in order for the government to function properly, you must vote affirmative to value property rights above the economic interests of the community. We can never ethically violate human rights. Valuing rights over the economic interest of the community is a simple choice. I believe renowned economist Adam Smith put it best, as he said, quote, the first and chief design of every system of government is to give each one the secure and peaceable possession of his own property, end quote. Stand with me to prevent violations of human rights and to uphold a just government. But in the meantime, I stand open for questioning by my opponent.
All right. Thank you so much for that speech, and congrats on making it to finals. I have a 3-minute timer here.
Yeah.
All right. And it looks like we're all ready, so I'll go ahead and get started. Oh, it has not started. There we go. Let's agree to a few basic ideas. Could we agree that first and foremost, this debate is about principles and not about policies?
Yes.
And can we also agree that this debate is about general ideas? You're not arguing for anarchy. I'm not arguing for communism, right?
I believe it would be fair to argue the implementation of the ideas that we're debating, because values have effects, and whatever choices the government might make in valuing whatever side will have necessary consequences. But generally speaking, it's preferred that we stick to the values of the things that we're debating.
Okay, we shouldn't argue extremes in this debate round, right?
Yeah, that's a fair assumption. Yeah.
Right. And if a judge valued the science to vote for one side, that doesn't mean that they choose the eradication of that side or the other side, right?
Absolutely not.
Right. And we can agree that this debate only occurs within instances of conflict, right?
Yes.
Right. Can rights be limited?
I believe that rights are foundationally limited. According to my definition of property rights, it is the ability to use your property as you see fit, provided it does not invade the rights of others. Human rights are intrinsically limited by other human rights.
Okay. Is it your contention that rights are the only thing that limit rights?
I believe that if the government were to impose limitation for the sake of or protection of other human rights, that would be a just limitation, because it's still for the sake of human rights.
Okay. Is there any other limitation, or is that the only one?
The only just limitation on human rights should be other human rights interest.
Okay, so we can never limit another person's right for something other than a right, correct?
Yes.
Right. Can we ever then limit the right to property for the sake of the economic interest of the community?
I believe any limitations that are not for the sake of rights and the economic interest of the community are unjust limitations, because that would be the government intentionally failing its duty of prioritizing rights at its highest.
Okay. Neither side in today's debate is advocating for something immoral, right?
I believe that one side to be preferred over the other means that one is at least more immoral than the other. And in this case, because we're debating the duty of the government, essentially, that means that if the government were to fail its duty, that would be immoral.
Sure, but the intention of either side is not to promote immorality, right?
The intention of either side isn't to promote morality, but the effects of each side might include things that are immoral.
Sure. You defined the right to property as usage of what people own, essentially, right?
Yes, specifically provided it does not invade the rights of others. Correct.
Sure. Could you repeat your definition of what the economic interest of a community is?
Sure. So I define community according to Cambridge Dictionary, which says, quote, the people living in one particular area or people who are considered as a unit because of their common interests, end quote. And I just related this to the economy because economy is an adjective in the resolution and not technically part of the definition.
Okay. Could we also agree that a government has a duty to the community as a whole?
I believe the government has a goal to uphold and secure the protection of that community, but the foundational purpose and the reason we have a government in the first place is to protect rights.
Sure. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
I have 7 minutes. Right. And it looks like we're all ready, so I'll go ahead and get started. In the month of June 2014, 3 children were found inside a condemned home in Albuquerque, living with their grandmother. 9 malnourished dogs were found inside without any food or any water. There were flies and feces around the house. The house had no running water, no electricity, and some of the floors were nothing but concrete. For the well-being of both the public and the children taken from the home, the house was taken by the government, and the grandmother was put under arrest. In Minnesota in 2012, a report was released by the Minnesota Office of Justice, which reported that they were having difficulty rescuing victims of human trafficking because they could not enter private property easily. And currently, schools are fighting for the ability to search students' lockers, persons, and possessions for potential drugs because of the students' right to property. The vagueness of the term reasonable suspicion leaves schools with less power to combat the accessibility of illegal, destructive, and potentially lethal substances to young children. And there's a common theme in all 3 of these examples, that exceptions must be made to private property rights. It's because property rights are not absolute, I would negate the resolution. And to begin, I'd like to clarify what the resolution is really asking, beginning with 2 points of resolution analysis. The first you can write down is purpose of rights. RA1, purpose of rights. When we're discussing rights, it's important to understand, well, why do we have rights to begin with? Regarding the English philosopher John Locke, Dr. Stephen Ford wrote in 2009 that, quote, the basis for Locke remains a higher order, moral imperative to further the good of mankind as a whole. Locke's defense of property was property being instrumental to a larger good. Property rights were rendered secure by the fact that they were only approved means to that good, end quote. In other words, rights are tools. They're means to a greater end. Rights are good things for the sole reason that they lead to good things, because an ability in and of itself isn't valuable. It's only because that ability can be utilized to bring about good things that rights have any meaning. But moreover, when we're discussing the purpose of rights, we have to ask ourselves the question, well, what are the function of rights? And in doing so, is there any limitations? And because we live in America, it's easy to think that rights are absolute things. It's easy to think that freedom is absolute and that we should protect it at all costs. However, we cannot just avoid the problem of human nature, because history proves that time and time again, rights can be abused. Terrorists abuse their right to liberty to murder vast amounts of people. Bad people shoot up schools, churches, and communities. We can't deny it. There do exist situations in which we have to restrain rights in order to protect people. Now, the affirmative might come up and say something along these lines, and has come up and said something like this, that we only limit rights in order to protect rights. But I think that's an oversimplified picture. When a right harms society, it ought to be limited. That leads me to my second point of resolution analysis, conflict. Again, conflict. Now, we agreed upon this in cross-examination, so I won't spend too much time here. But what the resolution asks us is to value one at the expense of the other. And to clarify, it doesn't mean eliminating the other side just in instances of conflict. Thus, the resolution really asks us this question. When one individual's right to property harms the economy, well, what should we do? And I think this question is best understood through my value of justice. Again, justice. Because looking at the resolution, the question it asks is entirely centered around justice. Is it right that we allow an individual unrestrained ability to harm the economy? Or is it the right thing to do to protect the economy? The resolution asks us what is right, not what is convenient. And justice should be our highest value for 2 main reasons. The first is that the resolution's language of ought to implies a moral obligation, so it's a moral question. And the second reason is that this is a moral debate, as doing the right thing should always be our end goal. And here I'd like to briefly respond to the entirety of the affirmative. You can simply mark my response as makes sense in a vacuum, not in conflict. Makes sense in a vacuum, not in conflict. I'd absolutely agree. Of course, you are entitled to your rights, your natural rights to life, liberty, and property. But I don't think the debate lies there, because the debate lies within a realm of conflict, when one principle directly conflicts with the other. I don't think necessarily that you have these rights or abilities, or you should use those abilities to harm the economy or to harm other people. I think the question completely changes once we analyze this round or this resolution through the lens of conflict. And here I'd also like to clarify that I do believe the actor in today's debate should be the individual, as they're the ones following government limitations, and the right to property is a God-given right. This leads me to two primary contentions. The first you can write down is contention 1, we are the economy. Again, we are the economy. It's important to understand that a negative position is not at all about subjective material gain, because it forces my side into defending subjectivity. I think a better characterization of what the economic interest is found by Doctor of Economic Sociology Adam Hayes in 2022. And I quote, "Economics focuses on the production, distribution, and consumption of goods and services, and analyzes the choices that individuals make to allocate resources." Unquote. That last part is really important. It's the choices that individuals make regarding goods and services. And secondly, Cambridge Dictionary defines an interest as, quote, "what is important or necessary." So combined, what the economic interest of the community is really that which is necessary for individuals to make choices regarding goods and services. But it's a common misconception that the economy is just some money-making machine. However, a closer understanding of what the economy is tells us that it's not just about money. Rather, the economy is how individuals interact with each other. In other words, the economy is the choices that we make. As economist Ludwig von Mises wrote in 1949, quote, "Economics is about the actions of men," end quote. And since we're all social creatures, these interactions are inevitable. Thus, we take on certain roles and responsibilities because first, we live with other people, and second, the economy is necessary for people to live good lives. Why? A system of exchange is necessary for people to work together. The economy is the bloodline of society. That leads me to my second contention: protect the economy. Contention 2, protect the economy. If one individual's right to property harmed the economy, shouldn't we limit it? I'd argue that it should for two reasons. First, it defies the original purpose of rights by pursuing self-interest at the cost of society. While second, it's not right to harm everyone else's human flourishing just for the sake of your own. And in the real world, this principle is reflected through my application of EpiPen monopolies. A pharmaceutical company known as Viatris created a monopoly and arbitrarily drove up prices by 400% for EpiPens, crucial tools for people susceptible to allergic reactions. As a result, a class action lawsuit was settled that forced Viatris to reverse its monopolistic policies. They harmed the well-being of people, abused that right to property, and thus it was limited because it harmed the economy. The resolution simply asks us if the economy is a reasonable limitation on the right to property. I'd argue that it is. It must be limited when it harms society because it's a just thing to do. Because at the end of the day, people will always matter more than property. Thanks.
All right. Assuming everybody can see and hear me okay. Awesome. And I've got a 3-minute timer right here. If everybody's ready. All right, perfect. Then I will get started. Hey, Nathan, congratulations on making it to finals. Of course, I've got a couple of questions for you today. So the first thing I'd like to clarify is we can both agree, for the sake of the debate, that private property rights are human rights, correct?
They're natural rights, yes.
Yeah, sure, okay. And you can agree that the most basic implementation of our right to property is the right to our body, correct?
I suppose so, yes, but I don't actually think that represents a conflict in today's debate because at a certain level of what people are entitled to, like their humanity, that can't necessarily be taken away.
Okay, that's fair. So can an unjust government, according to the negative, uphold justice?
An unjust government? I think by virtue of that sentence, an unjust government cannot uphold justice.
Yeah, perfect. All right, and do you agree with the Declaration of Independence?
I would agree with that idea that we do institute government to protect rights, but I don't think their only duty is to protect rights. I think it's also to protect the well-being of the community when one individual harms it.
Sure. And so do you agree with my definition of the right to private property?
Yeah, it's about the usage of property.
Yeah, sure. And so is it your contention that the right to private property includes a right to harm others with your property?
Now, here I'd like to answer your question because I think there's a little bit of an equivocation being made. The way you define the right to property, you define it as an ability to use what you own as you see fit. However, what you're talking about in your question is a moral entitlement. Rights have two separate meanings in that sense. So, of course, you do have the ability to harm other people. You don't have the moral entitlement to harm other people either. So you can do it.
But you can agree that we're debating the concept, or as you said, values of these things, not the use or action of them.
I believe we are arguing the terms in the resolution as they're laid out. I think because you define the right to property as
Sorry, you can agree that the resolution specifically cites the right to private property rather than the use of property?
Yes, but like I said, what a right means has two distinct meanings, and you defined it as an ability, not a moral entitlement.
Okay. So you said the economic interest of the community is specifically the ability to make choice. Is your contention that interest essentially equates to liberty or choice?
My argument is that what the economic interest of the community is those things that are necessary for people to make choices within a society, in other words, the economy.
So it's your contention that interest and necessary or something that they need is the same thing, that they're synonymous?
I believe for the sake of a productive debate in today's debate round, we should view both sides as objective things. And I think the best way to do it is using Cambridge Dictionary's definition of an interest.
Okay, so you're saying essentially that having a vested interest in something is not objective. It's only objective if it's a need?
I think my definition of interest is fairly self-explanatory. It's those things that are necessary for people to make choices. In other words, if we didn't have it, this thing would essentially collapse because that's what necessary means.
Okay, I have no further questions. Thank you. And I'll be starting my prep time at 3 minutes on the clock, starting right now. All right, no further prep time needed. I have 1 minute and 27 seconds of prep time remaining. All right, 4 minutes on my clock. If everybody's ready, awesome. Then I will get started. Quote, property must be secured or liberty cannot exist, end quote. John Adams. The purpose of property is to give us individualism, the ability to control our own purpose. Now, in the conflict of today's debate, that means that the negative team is advocating for undermining or sacrificing that ability for the detriment of the economic interest of the community. Now, I'll be discussing this first and primarily by refuting my opponent's arguments and reestablishing some points of the affirmative case. The first thing I'd like to discuss is him specifically citing that Locke listed property rights as the end to the means of a society that is flourishing or generally well off. You could tag my response to this as Locke supports the affirmative. John Locke supports the affirmative. In the second treatise of government, John Locke specifically states that the only just government that can possibly exist is a government that secures and protects individual property rights. That alone is the intentional purpose of government, the reason we have one in the first place. Next, he argued essentially that rights can be abused. He brought up a couple of examples of this in his introduction to his last speech. You could tag my response simply as no right to harm. No right to harm. I believe my opponent said it best when he said that we're debating the terms found within the resolution. In this resolution, it specifically cites an individual's right to property. You have no right to harm within your right to property. If we look at my definition of the right to property, it's the ability to use what you own as you see fit, provided it does not invade the rights of others. People trapping their grandkids in abusive situations or homes is not the right to property. That's just people abusing other people, something the affirmative is not responsible for advocating for. Next, he brought up the value of justice, where you can simply tag my response as impossible without a just government. Impossible without a just government. According to James Madison, John Locke, and the Declaration of Independence itself, the only way to achieve a just government is a government that secures and protects individual property rights. As James Madison said, quote, "This being the end of government, that alone is a just government, which impartially secures to every man whatever is his own," end quote. The only way to achieve a just government is to create a government that secures and protects property rights at the highest, something my opponent is negating or undermining. This means he's undermining a just government and then cannot uphold justice. He also argued that the affirmative only makes sense in a vacuum, not a conflict. You could tag my response to this as rights are intrinsic. Rights are intrinsic. The right to private property is intrinsic, which means that all arguments for the right to private property stand regardless of circumstance. Whether you're in a vacuum, someone's shoelace, or whatever, you always have your right to property. It is an intrinsic foundational right. Makes you argue that the economic interest is essentially the ability to make choices. You could tag my response to this as in interest, not need. Interest, not need. He essentially equated the terms interest and need, but previously he argued that we're using the terms found in the resolution. Saying that interest is the same thing as need is the same thing as me asking my mom to go to McDonald's on the way home from speech club because I'm starving. I'm not starving. I don't need McDonald's, but it is an interest of mine. And the last argument I like to respond to is this argument of protecting the economy, the second contention. You could tag my response as not at the cost of rights. Not at the cost of rights. My opponent agreed in cross-examination that the simplest definition of property is the right to our body. And judges, I am a universal blood donor. I could give blood to anybody. Now, does this really authorize the government to take my blood or my property at its simplest form for the sake of other people who need blood in the hospitals without my consent? No, of course not, because an individual's rights must be valued at its highest. I agree that the interest of the community is helpful and generally something that should be upheld, as it is a goal of the government. But more important than the goal of the government is the purpose of a government. The only reason we have one in the first place is to protect and secure rights. And this is why you ought to evaluate the resolution through the lens of the government. Should the government really be able to take individuals' rights? As the affirmative, I would argue no. Thank you.
I'll take some prep time. I have 3 minutes. I'll pause my prep time there, 1 minute and 47 seconds. 6 minutes. All right, and it looks like we're all ready, so I'll go ahead and get started. The economist Thomas Sowell once noted that, quote, property rights belong legally to individuals, but their real function is social, to benefit vast numbers of people who do not themselves exercise these rights, end quote. Sorry, it looks like we lost a judge on my screen.
Yeah,
so I'll pause my time there.
Sounds good.
5 minutes.
Oh. Think she might be back.
All right, can you all hear and see me okay? Okay, so got my time again, 5 minutes and 48 seconds. I'll go ahead and resume that.
Actually, I'm sorry, I didn't hear any part of your speech. Could you please start it from the beginning? I'm so sorry.
Okay. So if it's all right with everyone, my timer is back at 6 minutes, and I will go ahead and get started. The economist Thomas Sowell once noted that, quote, property rights belong legally to individuals, but their real function is social, to benefit vast numbers of people who do not themselves exercise these rights, end quote. John Locke, Thomas Sowell, the affirmed negative position, we all make the same argument, that the reason why we have rights is to benefit everybody, not just one person, especially when that one person's ability to use his property harms the rest of us. And for that reason, I'd ask you to negate the resolution. I'd like to clarify what the resolution is really asking us in 3 responses and summarize my position in 1 voting issue. So the first response you can tag is conflict. Response 1, conflict. There are 2 big ideas I want you to remember here. The first is simply a clarification. The negative position does not abolish rights. I think that's really important in this debate. It does not abolish rights. It does not take away the ability to make choices. That's not what the negative position is arguing here. So the conflict is not taking away that choice. It's simply saying in a very hyper-specific instance of conflict, the individual's right to property, what he wants to do with his property should be put on pause just as an instance of conflict. But a second idea I want you to note is that there's an equivocation being made under the affirmative argumentation. Essentially, he's changing definitions of what the right means in the middle of his argument. He essentially said 2 things. At first, Locke supports the affirmative and that you don't have a right to harm other people. The first idea that Locke supports the affirmative, I think he supports both ideas. He definitely supports this idea of property, but he also supports the idea of the negative, that you shouldn't use your right to property to harm the economy either. That's the entire point of my quote in the first resolution analysis. But here's where the equivocation plays in. My opponent said you don't have a right to harm another person. I completely agree. You don't have a moral entitlement to harm another person. That's one meaning of what the word right means. However, I'll take you back to his 1AC. He defined what the right to property is as the ability to use what you own as you see fit. That's incredibly different from a moral entitlement. It's not the same thing. So under my opponent's own definition, you do have an ability to harm other people. It's the argument simply that you shouldn't do so. And here's a reason why it's not a moral entitlement either. If it was simply a moral entitlement, that wouldn't be a conflict in today's debate. How do an individual's moral entitlement to his property actually conflict with the economic interests of the community? Because again, under the definitions that I provided and the affirmative has simply disagreed with and hasn't really provided any counter definition of interest, he's simply saying that, well, we shouldn't do it because it's a violation of that right. Again, if it is a situation of conflict, how can we do so if it's simply a moral entitlement? Under the affirmative's own interpretation of what a right means, it's an ability, not a moral entitlement. There are 2 separate things. The conflict in today's debate is about the ability of the right to property. My second response you can mark down as response to necessities. Again, necessities. Now, I'd like to go back to the NC. I operationally define what the economic interest of the community is as those things that are necessary for people to make choices within a society. In other words, the economy, when we're distributing goods and services. Now, here I'd like to, again, remind you of the definition of an interest as according to Cambridge Dictionary. It's that which is important or necessary. 2 things to note here. My opponent didn't actually respond directly to Cambridge Dictionary's definition. That is per verbatim what their definition is. But a second idea is, I think when my opponent makes the analogy that, oh, I'm interested in getting ice cream on the way home from speech club, that's not the same thing as the economic interest. There are 2 different contexts in which we use the word interest. I think the most appropriate way we use it is found in Cambridge Dictionary, things that are necessary. Because if they're just any arbitrary thing, it makes a negative position somewhat unfair because who's going to defend subjectivity for the sake of an objective right? I think both positions are objective and both things are morally good positions. So I think for the sake of a productive debate, we should use Cambridge Dictionary's definition of an interest. Now, the next thing I'd like to argue is, again, we're not abolishing rights. So when my opponent says it's impossible without a just government, I like to remind you that we're not abolishing a just government, and the government's duty is not only to protect rights, also to every citizen within that community, not just one individual and his or her right to property. Now, he also mentioned that rights are intrinsic. I completely agree, but that's simply put not the conflict in today's debate. It's not resolutional. I completely agree. In a vacuum, when you're not harming anyone else, when you're not in a conflict with anyone else, you are due your rights to life, liberty, and property. Of course, I don't have a debate there because that's not where the debate is. The debate is when one individual's right to property harms the economic interests of the community and vice versa. I simply believe that when an individual harms the economy, it's not acceptable because of the purpose of rights. But it is acceptable for there to be placed a limitation on the right to property because that has been the limitation ever since, I suppose, time began. The reason why we enter into society is not only to protect rights, but is also to protect the benefits and the people within that community as well. The final response you can mark is simply reasonable limitations. Again, reasonable limitations. Limitations on rights are not uncommon, nor are they unreasonable. There are incredibly good reasons for us to limit rights because people, at the end of the day, that's a reason why we limit rights for the sake of protecting people. My opponent makes a comparison of blood donors. That's simply not resolutional because it's not an economic interest. It would be nice for Finn, I suppose, to donate blood to people. Of course, not too much blood. My simple point is that's not an economic interest and it's not resolutional. That leads me to my 1 voting issue. Justice requires limits. Justice requires limits. The one singular question of the resolution is this: is the economy a reasonable limitation on the right to property? And I think parents and patriots understand this the best. Parents understand that there are certain sacrifices that have to be made for the functioning of the family as a whole. Patriots understand that they're not the only ones who live in the country. There are more things than just them and their individual rights. Everybody else in the community has these rights. They must be protected as well. Fundamentally, at the end of the day, economics is not about money. It's about people. And at the end of the day, people will always matter more than property. That's why I'd ask you to negate the resolution. Thanks.
All right. I had a minute and 27 seconds of prep time remaining. Setting that up right now. All right, 127, and I'll be starting that right now. All right. Now for the prep time. This will be a 3-minute speech. A 3-minute timer right there. If everybody's ready. All right, perfect. Then I will get started. Quote, man has 3 great rights, equally sacred from arbitrary interference: the right to his life, the right to his liberty, and the right to his property, end quote. Supreme Court Justice George Sutherland. It's the affirmative's contention that these 3 great rights must be upheld at their highest in today's round. And today I'm going to be discussing that, first by responding to my opponent's arguments, and then talking about 2 main voting issues to summarize the round. Now, the first argument I'd like to discuss is where he said that the negative doesn't abolish rights. You could tag my response as must sacrifice them. Must sacrifice them. Remember, my opponent defined a conflict as sacrificing one thing for the other. In this case, that means the negative must be sacrificing rights for the economic interest, something that is unjust and fails the duty of government. Next, he argued that you essentially do have a right to harm according to my definition because you have the ability to do so. You could tag my response to this as cannot invade rights. Cannot invade rights. If you look back to my affirmative constructive, we see that the definition of the right to property is the ability, yes, to use your property how you choose, provided it does not invade the rights of others. So yes, you can use your property as you wish, but you may not use it to harm others. Next, he again equated interest to necessity. You can tag my response to this as must be resolutional. Must be resolutional. We're discussing the resolution. If the resolution wanted us to debate the needs of the community, it would have us debate the needs of the community. Instead, we're asked to debate the interests of the community. These words are not the same and they are not synonymous. They are different meanings. Next, he argued that the government's duty is to all. You could take my response to this as purpose versus goal. Purpose versus goal. The implementation, the purpose, and the foundational reason we have a government, according to the Declaration of Independence, James Madison, John Locke, etc., is because their duty is to secure property or human rights in general. And for the sake of the argument, property rights. Now, this means that we're debating is the goal of government, protecting well-being of everyone, or the purpose, the reason we have one in the first place, in which case I would urge you to vote for the purpose of government. Next, he argued for essentially reasonable limitations on property. You could tag my response to this as no example of limitations. No example of limitations. All of the examples of limitations on the right to property that my opponent has brought forth have all been people abusing their right to property. Things like trapping children in abusive situations and harming other people in general. The right to property doesn't entail the ability to harm others. That is not within the resolution. My opponent has provided no actual examples of property rights in themselves being implemented or being limited for the sake of the economic interests of the community. Now, he argued that blood is not in the economic interest. You could take my response as resource. Blood is a resource that has to do with the economy, etc., etc. Lastly, he argued that it's rights versus people. You could take my responses as body is property. Body is property. My right to own my property or my body is my right to property. So people are defined under the right to property. Now, I have two main voting issues. The first you can tag as government duty. Government duty. The government's duty is to protect and secure property rights. I believe that this is how we should be deciding who wins today's resolution, who better upholds the government's duty, in which case I'd urge to vote for the affirmative. And it is for all these reasons that I would strongly urge an affirmative ballot. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you all so much for your time today, and great job, Finn. It was a really fun round.
Thank you. And once again, thank you all for taking our ballot.